No one reads a quality agreement, and I mean really reads a quality agreement until something breaks. A batch fails, or you get a complaint, or you see an inspector at your door and you need to figure out what is the notification timeline. If a quality agreement doesn't work during that situation, then your quality agreement doesn't work at all. And in this episode, I wanted to break down what is a quality agreement, what are some of the regulatory expectations around quality agreements, and what I think are the 5 most important sections of a quality agreement to get right. If it's your first time tuning into Let's Combinate, I'm your host, Subi Sadeh, and in this podcast, I cover what I think are important topics in pharma and medical device. And I've owned supplier management between a sponsor and supplier for more than 5 years of my career. And I've written a bunch of quality agreements, negotiated a bunch of quality agreements, updated quality agreements, and had to adhere to quality agreement requirements. And I think this is one of the most important topics because industry is continually moving towards more and more partnerships and outsourcing, and making sure that you understand what are your arrangements is just so critical. So what is a quality agreement? A quality agreement is a written document that defines GXP responsibilities between 2 or more parties, usually between a sponsor or product owner, manufacturing authorization holder, and a contract X, like a contract manufacturer, test lab, supplier, sterilizer, third-party logistics, contract design partner, or any external partner. And a quality agreement doesn't replace your business agreement like a master services agreement or a supply agreement or a technical agreement. Those will cover terms like payments and delivery or who owns IP and stuff like that. The quality agreement is focused on quality responsibility. So some examples of that are like who is responsible for executing deviation investigations, or who submits a recall or field alert to a health authority if something goes wrong, or what are the timelines for batch record review? What goes into a C of A? And this is really important because it sets you up for how you are going to be operating day to day with a company. One of the foundational sort of philosophical items that I wanted to get across before we jump into some of the weeds here is that whoever owns the product is ultimately responsible for ensuring that their product is manufactured in accordance with the appropriate requirements, even if some activities are contracted out. And this is highlighted in many places. It's highlighted explicitly in the FDA quality agreement guidance, but it's also highlighted implicitly in basically any regulation. And that is management responsibility and ownership. It ends up with who owns the product. And so you can outsource the work, but you can't outsource the responsibility. Let's walk through some of the key references in terms of how regulators view quality agreement. Let's start with FDA's QSR. 820.50 purchasing controls explicitly calls out the need to have written agreements between a company and any supplier. There's a section in purchasing controls that speaks to the requirement to have written agreements on change notification before implementation. And that is one of the 5 topics that we're going to go into as far as the clauses go. But it's explicitly stated in 820.50. In addition to that, ICHQ 10 talks about the expectation that you have defined responsibilities and written agreements, and that you're overseeing and monitoring the performance of any outsourced activities that are happening to a contracted partner. And ICHQ 10 reinforces that the sponsor is ultimately accountable for product quality. One kind of important note, as the FDA transitions towards QMSR in February of 2026, ISO 13485 doesn't explicitly state that you need a written agreement. It more speaks to risk-based approach and ensuring that you have documented expectations in your internal procedures around what is required. But by and large, in the medical device space globally, they're basically an expectation. The most important document that I wanted to talk about, because I think it's the only document that goes into detail around quality agreements is the FDA guidance on quality agreements, and it has some really important key takeaways. The first is that quality agreements are not legally required by themselves, but they're strongly recommended, and they can be reviewed during inspections, and this is important particularly when failures occur. The guidance has some case studies and situations that it goes through. So it goes through a situation where there was a test lab where there was a falsified test result, and the owner of the product claimed that they didn't have any knowledge of it, but the FDA still cited the owner because they failed to adequately oversee the contract test lab, emphasizing that, again, you can't outsource accountability and that due diligence is required for third-party labs, manufacturers, etc. The other thing it talks about is change control. So it uses an example of a contract facility where the facility made a manufacturing process change without notifying the owner. And because of that, the drug ended up failing its specification. And FDA cited both parties in this case because the absence of having a robust change control agreement around how they're going to be handling changes led to a major failure from a quality point of view. So those are just a couple of examples. I'd highly encourage you to read that document itself, but the message is clear. If it's not in writing, then both parties are accountable. Now, I think some of the common falls and misunderstandings around quality agreements is that sometimes companies will want to use vague language. There's this concept of plastic words that was introduced by a German, scientist, philosopher, whatever. And it's basically words that don't have a lot of weight and don't explicitly mean anything specific. So this is something like the word progress. Something that is perceived as a benefit as progress can be perceived as a negative as far as progress goes. Progress in and of itself doesn't mean anything unless it's being benchmarked against something else. Words like collaborate or support or quote unquote as appropriate or which may include. This kind of language can be helpful when, what you're trying to add in is illustrative examples. You're not trying to have this specific element be explicit, but using specific language, this is the party who investigates. This is the party who provides input within a certain amount of days, I think is a little bit better use of resource and time and the ink on the paper. Another thing is misaligned expectations. So you might think a partner handles complaints, but they expect you to investigate. If it's not clearly assigned in writing, then both of the parties are at risk. But now moving into what I think are the 5 sections that are the most important to make sure you have buttoned down in a quality agreement. So the first one is deviation and nonconformance handling. So this section needs to answer questions like who logs the deviation, who investigates it, in what system is it handled, who drafts and owns any kind of correction, CAPA, etc. What are the common closure timelines? Is the sponsor reviewing certain stages? Are they reviewing the whole thing? Are they just reviewing root cause? Are they reviewing it based on criticality? Are they only reviewing like critical majors, or are they reviewing critical major minor? These are really important considerations to make sure to have in a quality agreement. Quality agreements are typically first line of defense when things go wrong. And that's one of the main use cases for pulling up the quality agreement, and deviation and nonconformances are more or less when things don't go to plan. The next one is change control. And you saw the very subtle foreshadowing that we talked about earlier. And change control is the one section that's actually in 820.50 spoken to explicitly. So what kind of changes require the product owner's approval? How are changes communicated and documented? Who performs the impact assessments? Like I said, this is explicitly stated in 820.50, and it's one of the most important sections because when you are transferring a product into production, it's baseline. This is what the baseline product is. Any changes to that baseline product needs to be assessed for impact because you, as the person who owns the product, ultimately understand it better than anyone else. I think that's where things can go wrong, is when somebody who doesn't know the product very well may think, oh, this is not a change, and this is not a significant change. The next one is audits and regulatory inspection. Questions always come up around, can the sponsor audit the partner? Can the sponsor audit the subcontractors or sub-suppliers of a partner? How many auditors can come? Do they need to allow for-cause audits? How often are routine audits? Who responds to regulatory inspections? And can the sponsor be present during an inspection if it's related to their product? These kinds of considerations are really important, because when inspections happen, it's crunch time, and being able to visit your partner's site if an issue occurs is obviously really important. So this is an area where details are really important. The next one is complaint handling and field actions recalls. You get into detailed questions and considerations, especially when you talk about importer, distributor, economic operator, regulatory expectations here, because depending on what the arrangement is between you and the partner, who logs the complaint? Do you both log the complaint? Who investigates the complaint? Who determines if it's reportable under 21 CFR 314.80 for drugs and 21 CFR 803 or 806 for devices? How are recalls coordinated? This is really critical for medical devices and drugs on their own, but it's especially critical for combination products where you're dealing with a web of different reporting expectations. And you can look at like 21 CFR Part 4B to understand some of the nuance there, because it may trigger notifications that go beyond just the basic. There's some nuance there as a point. The last of the 5 important sections is documentation and record retention. So who owns keeping the original documentation? Things like, is the contractor responsible for maintaining originals indefinitely? Is it only for certain periods of time? Do you consider differences between things like validation documentation and batch records? What is the retention policy? Is it 5 years, 7 years, 10 years? Does the contractor need to get written prior approval from the sponsor before they destroy or get rid of any documentation? Is a really critical expectation. So all to say, a quality agreement isn't just any legal document. It's a really important operational tool that if something goes wrong, like a deviation, a batch failure, a field complaint, the quality agreement tells everyone what to do and who's supposed to do what. So it's really important to treat it as a document that reflects real and current processes, and that the timelines are workable, that roles are clearly assigned, and that especially with programs that last for really long times or products that are on the market for a really long time, that they are reviewed and revised periodically, especially with changes and audits and inspections and things like that. I will end off by saying is that quality agreements are inspectable, even though FDA and other regulators do not require them explicitly by law. Like I said, in the case of 820.50, it requires a written agreement, not a written quality agreement. You don't want to be caught unprepared. If this helped clarify anything about your quality agreements, please share it. And if you're enjoying the show, please give me feedback, leave a rating, or subscribe. It really helps out. And I will see you next time. Let's combinate.